Imagine this. You're a prisoner of war held captive in a foreign country, and you're being forced to stay awake. No sleeping, no rest, just endless days melting into endless nights. Sounds like something out of a horror movie, right? Well, strap in, folks, because we're about to dive into one of the most spine-chilling, goosebumps-inducing tales from the depths of war history, the Russian sleep experiment. It's a tale that takes us into the heart of darkness, where sleep is the enemy and sanity, well, sanity is often short-lived. And did I mention the mutilated corpse? Yeah, you heard that right. A body lifeless and torn apart in a frenzy. So if you're feeling squeamish, consider this your official warning, because we're about to push the limits of what it means to be human, diving headfirst into a realm where science dares to cross lines that probably should have been left alone. Now, before we plunge into this chilling abyss, why don't you give that like button a good spook by clicking it, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell just to make sure you're first in line for our next hair-raising adventure. So picture this. It's the peak of World War II, and Russian scientists have a goal, a wild, desperate idea. They want to keep their soldiers awake for days on end. The stakes, human lives, their guinea pigs, 5 unsuspecting prisoners of war, and the reward, freedom. Sounds like a fair trade, right? If the prisoners survive, they'll be let go, but let's see what really happens. The scientists cooked up this freaky gas chamber, a sealed off world where sleep would just be a memory. And to keep the Sandman at bay, they'd pump in this experimental gas. Did they know that it wouldn't kill the prisoners of war? Not really. They only had a hunch it might be okay. So in go our 5 prisoners of war, probably hearing their own heartbeats as the only sign of life. If they could beat this experiment, freedom would be theirs. But remember, this is old school. They didn't have fancy schmancy security cameras. All they had was a few microphones and a tiny 5-inch porthole window to spy on the madness within, kind of like how a shark might peek through the window of a submarine. So the first few days of being in the gas chamber starts off like any regular sitcom, with a group of 5 dudes just sitting there, shooting the breeze, hanging out, whatever. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? Just your standard kind of bro talk to kill the time. But then day 4 waltzes in, and wham! Suddenly the room's filled with more regrets than a failed 3 a.m. online shopping spree. The fellas start wondering if they're signing their names on the dotted line for this sleep deprivation marathon was perhaps not the brightest idea they've ever had. Now, we gotta remember, these just aren't your everyday lads, right? They're prisoners of war, folks with a hard knock life story or two under their belts, and that's when the conversation takes a turn, diving into the deep end. The chatter starts to shift to the whoa, did you really just go there territory. They started talking about lost love and heartbreaks so brutal you'd think they were straight out of a tragic romance novel. They also talked about golden opportunities for dream jobs that slipped away, and then, as if the ambiance wasn't heavy enough, they started unloading the really deep stuff, messed up dreams, life's unfair curveballs, and how they wish they could all just go back and change it. It kind of seemed like they were trying to make sense of this whole wacky situation they were in by bonding over their past nightmares, sort of like a gloomy high school reunion where everyone just talks about how life has kicked them in the butt. So yeah, from casual chit chat and high spirits to a grim powwow of regrets, and all things said, that's pretty much how things went down. Now hold up, because this is where things get even crazier. Fast forward to day 6, and it's like someone hit the mute button. The chatty crew turned into a bunch of mute mimes overnight. They started to get paranoid and didn't think they could trust each other, so they just each went off into their own little corner of the chamber and were more or less silent. However, each of them started to become tempted by an intrusive thought. Could they sell each other out for a shot at freedom? And this is when we start to see their sanity reality shift. The prisoners started playing mind games. They'd sneak up to the porthole window or the microphones that were in obviously plain sight, and they'd whisper made-up stories about the others, hoping that by revealing false inner secrets about their comrades, they themselves would be set free. But the scientists, they were just along for the ride, sitting back and watching the twisted soap opera unfold. When day 9 finally arrived, the vibe in the room got much worse. Things like food and water were ignored. Subjects were claiming their corners in the chamber like stray cats, barely whispering to each other anymore, and eyeing everyone else like they were the enemy. They were practically swimming in a sea of suspicion and paranoia, just like a bunch of reality show contestants wondering who's going to get the boot next. But then, bang, day 10 kicked off, not with the chirp of a bird or a cheerful good morning, but with a scream that would make a horror movie ghost proud. It ripped through the silence like a chainsaw, making everyone in the chamber snap to attention. The test subjects, each curled up in their own territory of the chamber, practically jumped out of their skin. Yeah, folks, that's how day 10 greeted them, with an outburst so loud and terrifying it could wake up the dead. One of the subjects had snapped. He screamed his lungs out, running around like a chicken with its head cut off. The dreadful display went on for 3 hours. Can you imagine being trapped in a small room with someone just screaming their head off for 3 hours straight? He screamed so much that eventually his screams turned into weak squeaks. Turns out he had shredded his own vocal cords from the sheer force of his screams. Now, what's really odd about this story is that aside from their initial reaction, the rest of the prisoners of war didn't bat an eye, like the blood-curdling screams were just white noise. Instead, they went to town on the books inside of the chamber, tearing out all the pages. They then took these damp and sticky pages and plastered them all over the porthole window, blacking out the scientists' view of their little world. After the screamers' voice box finally gave out, an eerie silence blanketed the chamber. The scientists were left in the dark, literally and figuratively. The only thing they had left was the sound of silence. 3 days went by with nothing but silence, an ominous void only matched by the pitch black porthole window. The only sign of life was the oxygen levels, which told them that 4, maybe 5 subjects were still hanging on. But the silence was giving them the creeps. They started to wonder, were the microphones still working, or was something more sinister unfolding inside of the chamber? After all, they didn't know because they couldn't see in. So hoping to get some answers, the researchers used the intercom, planning to go inside for a microphone check. They told the subjects just to lie down, stay out of their way, and to sweeten the deal, they told them they'd release someone as long as everyone played nice. After the message, all they got was dead air. None of the prisoners responded, but then out of the blue, a voice broke the silence. One prisoner of war said into the microphone, "We no longer want to be freed." Floored, the scientist held off on entering, now knowing the subjects were still alive and the mics were working just fine, which I kind of find odd because as scientists, they're trained to be skeptical. So just because they heard one voice speak up doesn't mean that everyone was still alive. But for whatever reason, the scientists were seemingly convinced that everyone was okay. Now listen up, because I feel like this is where the story takes a hair-raising turn. But before we continue any further, if you're finding this spine-chilling account enjoyable, don't forget to cast a curse upon that like button with a stroke of terror. So after the scientist realized the mics were still working, the silence in the chamber resumed, and this skin-crawling quiet held on until midnight of day 15. That's a good 4 to 5 days where the scientists were only observing silence. Feeling like it was time to wrap up this nightmare experiment, the scientists decided to turn off the stimulant gas and replace it with fresh air. But the moment the gas cleared, the chamber erupted with screams, shattering the silence like a glass pain, and then came the moment of truth. When they finally cracked open the chamber door, they were met with a scene straight out of a horror flick, and I have to warn you, it's pretty gruesome, so if you're at all squeamish, it might be best to stop watching. 4 subjects were still kicking while the 5th was completely lifeless. Chunks of his flesh were torn off and stuffed into the room's drain. The room was knee-deep in stagnant water littered with bits of flesh from the living subjects. It was later found out that they had done this to themselves. They had essentially cannibalized their own bodies, including the body that was lying dead, soaking in water. The food was left untouched for days as the subjects took a terrifying detour into madness, eating their own flesh instead of food that was provided to them by the researchers. The experiment had taken a dark turn into a chilling spectacle of unhinged insanity. The subjects were basically glued to the chamber, begging for a refill of the unknown gas. When they brought in soldiers to drag them out, it turned into a free-for-all. One subject went all zombie, biting into a soldier's neck. The soldier didn't stand a chance. He bled out right then and there. Chaos ensued, and one of the subjects, while they were trying to remove him from the chamber, ruptured his spleen, leading immediately to his untimely death. So 2 people ended up dying just trying to get everyone out of the chamber. They managed to pry the remaining 3 subjects out and ship them off to medics, their bodies decorated with all sorts of self-inflicted horror. They had to be held down, and they were starving, and they looked like skeletons with a thin sheet of skin covering their bones, and their flesh was a canvas of gruesome injuries. The one who got the worst of it was whisked off to surgery, while the other 2 were stashed in a separate room. When they tried to give the prisoner who was going to surgery some medication that would help put him to sleep, something went wrong. It was like the guy was immune to the stuff. He fought and writhed, saying how he desperately wanted to get back to the gas chamber. He pleaded and pleaded to go back. The medical team, knowing that he needed life-saving surgery, decided it was showtime. They needed to knock him out with something as soon as possible, but this guy didn't back down, kicking and screaming against all the sleeping medication they were giving to him, begging to stay awake so he could get back to the gas chamber. He put up such a fight that he ripped off one of the leather straps that was holding him down. So finally, they gave him a much larger dose of the sleeping medication, and eventually he went to sleep. Unfortunately, the moment that he fell asleep, his life slipped away. They did everything in their power to try to revive him back, but they could just not bring him back to life. After he died, they decided to take a look at the guy who shredded his vocal cords from screaming. They wheeled him in for surgery, and even though he couldn't say a word, he made it pretty clear that he too wanted to go back to the chamber. His head shaking was so intense he passed out from exhaustion, and just like the first guy, the moment he was out cold, he died as well. So at this point in the story, there's only one guy left. The other 2 who had made it out of the chamber had dropped dead the moment they fell asleep, leaving researchers scratching their heads. They decided to skip surgery for the last man standing. After watching 2 attempted operations end in failure, they thought the best move was to try to get this last guy standing back to the gas chamber and turn the gas back on. It seemed like that was pretty much the only thing they could do to keep him alive. As they got ready to send him back to the chamber, they brought out a new toy, an electroencephalogram, also known as an EEG, something they hadn't used in this experiment yet. After attaching some special sensors to the scalp using some sticky material, the EEG lets them measure brain waves inside of the head to see if something's wrong. After the subject was hooked up to the EEG, the researchers noticed something weird going on inside of his brain. The electrical signals would just stop out of the blue, they'd flatline, and then jump right back to normal. One of the researchers noticed a link between these flatline moments and the guy blinking. It looked like every time he blinked, his brain was sneaking in a micro nap, a split-second snooze, making his brain look like it was shutting down, almost like what happens when you die. Fearing that the final subject project would meet the same sleepy end as the previous two prisoners of war, the scientists were in a mad rush to get the gas flowing again because this is the one thing that seemed to keep them alive, but they were just a little too late. The last man standing slipped into a deep sleep. The EEG showed his brain activity sliding into dreamland before flatlining, signaling brain death as his heart gave up as well. After he died, the researchers wondered what killed him. Was it the gas? Was it the sleep deprivation? Did his brain become so dependent on the gas that once the gas was removed, his brain couldn't function properly? They didn't really know. What actually killed him really is anyone's guess. No one really knows. This tale is beyond creepy for sure, but it's crucial to remember that there's no really hard proof to back up its authenticity. The fact that the scientists were so comfortable not being able to see their test subjects is definitely a red flag for me. I can't imagine them wanting to just immediately intervene after the prisoners of war had covered up their porthole window with pages from books, especially when the chamber was silent and no one was making any noise. I also find it suspicious that there was a large amount of water in the chambers and the researchers were unaware until the door was open. Did the water just rush out once the chamber door was open? How did they manage to flood the entire room without the researchers knowing? If they did flood the room, either the researchers should have heard the sound of water from the microphones in the chamber, or if they were the kind of mics where you had to press a button in order to hear a sound, then the researchers definitely wouldn't have been comfortable just sitting back for days without observing anything. So I definitely think this tale is absolutely fiction. However, in the terrifying 1940s, during the atrocities of World War II, there's documented proof of humans being used as lab rats in horrifying ways, like the infamous Unit 731 of the Japanese, where experiments were straight out of a horror show, including slicing people open without using anesthesia, forcing pregnancies, and deliberately giving subjects plague and syphilis just to see what would happen and what would happen to the fetuses. This was happening alongside equally horrific human experiments in Germany, like hypothermia tests and prison trials and high altitude experiments. These instances don't directly point its finger at Russia, but they do paint a dark picture of a time when appalling human experimentation was, sadly, not out of the ordinary. So the Russian sleep experiment might not have proof that it happened, but considering the 1940s scene, it's not a total stretch to think that an experiment like this could have happened somewhere. The details might be different, but the idea of such an experiment isn't entirely far-fetched. Our understanding of sleep and the effects of missing out on it is still a work in progress, and it's a pretty complex one. We still don't really know why we need sleep, but research has definitely shown that staying awake too long can mess with your mind, even bringing on psychosis. Symptoms can range from seeing things that aren't there, paranoia to jumbled thinking, all signs you're in serious mental illness. And that's a wrap on this mind-bending story, the Russian sleep experiment. While we can't say for sure if this experiment is a true tale, it's key to remember that this spooky story reflects real and horrific experiments that did go down during World War II. This tale also gets us thinking about how crucial sleep is to our minds and bodies, and even though the events in the story push beyond any sort of documented time without sleep, it gives us a glimpse into what could happen when our sleep gets seriously messed up. So that's it for the Russian sleep experiment. Maybe you think it's just a scary story, or maybe you think it might have actually happened. Either way, I hope you found it intriguing. Before we call it a day, please remember to smash that like button if you enjoyed this wild ride. Remember to subscribe to our channel to catch more spine-chilling stories, and don't forget to ring that notification bell so you'll be first up to know when our next spooky adventure kicks off. Until then, stay curious, stay aware, and when you're tired, stay in bed.